I'm Raven, and welcome back to the lair. You'll be wondering, why am I wearing a cloak? Well, I made this cloak for dragon meat a couple of years ago. During the course of dragon meat it became damaged, and the clasp no longer held fast. And since I have it out, I thought, let's fix it up. Let's get to it. As you can see, the cloak is intended to fasten using this ring going through a loop. Goes straight through there, bam, perfect job. But the fabric is loosened and the ring simply slips out. So what I want to do is replace this with a pin and ring system. So instead of having to loop through the fabric, we use a metal rod that is slightly longer than the hoop, so that when it is caught in there, it cannot come out unless you manually feed it out. How are we going to do this? Well, a little bit of modification. To get started, I have this short piece of aluminium rod. It is about 8 centimeters long, which is basically double the size of my hoop. I'm willing to cut it down to the necessary length, but I believe it needs to be about that much to prevent it from slipping out in either direction. And you'll see that I've marked with a nice permanent marker a little cross. That gives us a level along the rod and a space to avoid going into. I've picked aluminium because it'll be nice and easy to work. I don't need anything heavy like steel, and we don't really need anything stronger. And along with that, I've got my Dremel with a very small drill piece, and I've got the smallest desk vise that I have. I appreciate this is not a settled desk vise. Don't leave comments saying that's a really not a settled desk vise. So we're just going to clamp this in as level as we can. That'll do nicely, I think. Yep. Then we're going to bring it over to the Dremel. I've got my 1.2mm drill piece on the Dremel here, and what I'm going to do is I've got it on the slowest speed setting, and I'm going to drill onto this side of the mark. So I'm going to line myself up carefully, and then hit it. Nice and gentle. Let it find its bearing. Okay, a little bit faster, taking up to 10. Go, and we got ourselves a nice little needle hole through the bar. And we'll do exactly the same thing for the next one. I'm going to increase the speed to just above 10. There we go. And that's all we'll need the Dremel for. With that though, I'm just going to take some of my needle files, and we're just going to nice and neaten these off so that we do not hurt ourselves or others. Before we attach this to the cloak, we are going to paint it, but before we do that, we need to make sure it is the right size. And we need to do something about the ends, because where I've cut it with the pliers, it's still sharp. We'll do that with filing, but first, let's make sure that this is just right. Now we have the rod, we need to figure out the rest of what needs to go on. The idea is the cloak fastens up here at the neck, and then this part comes along here, forming a nice little diamond down the front. With the new rod system, the hoop is now on the wrong layer. So we're going to need to take the hoop off and reaffix it to the upper layer. There'll then need to be a hole for the loop to come up through to clasp onto this ring. Let's take a closer look. You can see the hoop is fastened on with 2 pieces of thread. This is a bit of a design flaw. I should really have affixed it on with 3 so that it always held perfectly safe. But removing it is simply a case of cutting the thread and getting rid of the loose bits. The fur underneath should not be damaged. The hole, well, for the pin, the hole is going to be way too big. But I did a fine job of making sure that it was not going to fray any further. All we need to do is stitch the hole further up. We only need to have a small hole for the rod to stick through and clamp onto. At which point the ring, which will be transferred to here, will take the brunt of the force. Step 1, let's get snippy. I want to be careful not to cut the fur. Just want to get rid of the thread without giving myself a trim at the same time. I wound this up with several layers of thread because it needs to be nice and strong, and I will rebind it with a similar number of strands. And that's 2. I'll know where the pin needs to be because on the other side I still have the markings that I made when I initially placed the ring on. Looking at the old ring hole, it is a very big hole, and naturally we can't stitch it up too cleanly. So what I'm going to do is meet the edges together like so, and then on the other side it'll be quite discreet and hidden behind the ring. This is of course the point where you realise you are supposed to leave a hole for the rod to go through. Let's just reopen that hole. All I'm going to do is cut the stitching that I just made, and I'll re-stitch the edges. Because I double stitch it back and forth, it shouldn't completely fall apart. Now that we have that fixed, we can turn our attention to the ring. The ring needs to be affixed centrally around our hole, like this, and then affixed onto the fabric at 3 locations, which will ensure that it cannot shift or move on the fur. If I take my rod and poke it through, you see the idea is that it comes on through, boop, and then sits on top of there. There'll be a certain amount of leeway required on the underside where the thread is being held on, but once it is through and looped, in order to unfasten the cloak you have to tension it tight and then pull it back through. But first, let's secure the ring. With that done, we now need to think about the length of our rod and the amount of fabric that we will need to feed it through. The shorter our rod, the less slack we will need to feed it through and clamp it up. However, if it's too short, it will be able to jostle out of place and slip down through the ring. Ideally, if somehow the horizontal position of this rod were to come all the way across here, it would still not slip out. And the same goes for the other direction too. We also have to bear in mind that we are going through a hole, and this will be essentially dangling loose. So, how much dangle do we need on our rod? It'll need to be able to come all the way through here, plus half this length, so that the fabric can come all the way up. But of course it's worth bearing in mind that there is a certain amount of give and play in the fabric, both on this end and on this end. Well, to test this, we're going to have to affix the rod to the cloak, but at the same time we want to be able to paint this rod afterward, so we don't want to bother stitching it on too firmly. So we're just going to use some very loose stitching to attach the rod and then give it a test, and we'll see how much it slips by. Once we've done that, we can see how much we can take off the length. The shorter the length of the rod, the tighter the cloak will stay. Now for the moment of truth. It's important to remember that this rod's just being held on by a single thread, so we don't want to overstrain it. So that feeds through very clearly and then comes to Clasp. And as you can see, the cloak is locked. That is not going to come undone. But how much shifting is possible? Looks like under manual strain I can pull it all the way across, but unnatural wear, I'm just going to jostle the fabric here, that is not moving at all. So we can shorten the rod. I wager I can take the rod down by a centimetre on each end, bringing it down to a nice neat 6.4 millimeters, and still have it be nice and secure. Even with just the one thread, the rod is holding nicely, and the cloak is sitting properly. Okay, I've detached the rod, and now I'm just going to mark a very conservative centimetre from the end. So I don't want to take more than a centimetre. So I'm going to make sure it's nice and square at the end. I'm going to mark just shy of the centimetre location. This will give us a final rod of somewhere around 6.5 mil. My pair of pliers. With that done, we can once again look at finishing this rod off. First thing I want to do is take off these nasty sharp edges. I'm going to take my needle file and I'm just going to file this thing down until the ends are nice and safe and smooth. Again, because it's aluminium, it'll work very easily and very nicely. Alright, with all that done, I'm going to give this a good old paint. I'll hit it with a primer, then a silver colour, and then finally a gloss varnish, just so it stays nice and shiny. There we go, one finished rod, painted and varnished. Now what we need to do is stitch it on properly. Let's go back, and I'll show you how to do this. Now we have our rod, we need a nice long piece of thread. You saw me do this in the time lapse, but this time I'll actually tell you what I'm doing. You don't want the rod to ever come disassociated from the fabric, or the thread. You want it to always be a consistent length away, because otherwise it's just not going to work properly. So, first thing I'm going to do is just bring our thread through all the way. And this is a very long piece of thread that I'm using. Then feed it back through, which is a little tricky because of the fur, but feed it back through vaguely near where you fed it in. And now you're going to want to trap it with a knot. So just poke it through the back, feed the thread through itself, bring it all the way through. There. So that thread is now anchored as a base. So it cannot go any further, it cannot go any back. Feed it through. The first few times you do this is going to take a while because you've got a lot of thread to get through. Then we take our rod, feed the thread through, one, and then you feed the rod back until it is half its length on its end, like that. That way, once we're finished stitching it up, it will always be the correct length away from the fabric. A bit hard to see because of the fur, but trust me, that's half a length like that. Now, we don't want the rod to either feed along either side of the thread, thus imbalancing it. So it's important that as we go through, we continue to entrap the thread around the rod. So what I recommend you do is when going through the second hole, come under in the same way that you came up. That way you will start to entrap the thread. And each time you loop round, you will enforce that trap. So now we've done that, we can take the thread back through. So that is now pulling the rod against the fabric. And then once again, entrap the thread. And you'll need to entrap the thread every single time you complete a loop. And as you can see, even with just this one thread, it is the correct length and it won't shift along the thread. And now we just do this as many times as we can. The more times, the stronger it'll be. I'm going to intend to try and get at least 10 loops. Maybe I'll get a bit more. And there we have it. One cloak securely and firmly clasped that one can toss back for a bit of fisticuffs and then bring back down for more peasantry travel. It's a nice bit of stitching, not too difficult, and you know, it's a good solid hold. That's not going to go anywhere. Pull it back out, fully feed it down, and you can take it off. That's going to do it for this video. Until next time, I'm Raven, and that's all from the lair.